Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Delora Story Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the debate over immigration continues to dominate headlines. What is the latest news from Washington? How are Utahns responding? And how could this impact our state in the short and long term? Utahns are turning their attention to the midterm elections. How are candidates wooing delegates? Which initiatives are moving forward? And what races are getting hot? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Lisa Riley-Roche, political reporter with the Deseret News, Rod Arquette, host of the Rod Arquette Show, and Glenn Beebe, reporter with ABC4 Utah. Thank you for being with us. I want to jump right into the midterm elections. Lisa, I know you love this time of year. We're starting to see who the candidates are, who's getting signatures, who's going through the caucus convention system, and really try to understand who is going to make it to the end, all right? But I want to talk about our 4th congressional district for just a moment, because we have some new polling out that shows that Mia Love leads Ben McAdams 49% to 43%. Tell us about this race, why it's staying so close, and what these candidates are doing to differentiate themselves.
Well, the 4th district has always been the best place for a Democrat to try to get that seat, because obviously we had a Democrat there for a decade plus. What's happening now, though, with the McAdams-Love race that I found particularly interesting is that Ben McAdams signed up to gather signatures to guarantee himself a spot on the ballot, the primary ballot, but may not end up doing that. He may just compete at convention. And what really makes that interesting is you've got Mia Love with no Republican challenger. She's a guaranteed spot in November. But Ben has 4 other Democrats who also want to be on that ballot.
That is so interesting. Rod, that is what people did not expect, right? Mia Love has no challenger, but Ben McAdams does.
And that is a big surprise. And what I find interesting on this race is how they're going to position themselves if it is Mia versus Ben, depending on what happens. How much will Mia embrace Trump? How much will Ben embrace Democratic leadership? Mia's got to walk the line. Will she embrace his policies but not the man? Ben's got to say to himself, how much do I embrace people like Nancy Pelosi, who yesterday came out and said, if we take the House, we're going to have a massive tax increase, which is not a popular move. So they're in a really unique position. How do we set up our campaigns, and what course do we take right now? And I don't know if that's been decided as of yet.
Glenn, so 52% of the people in this district said that they do not approve of President Trump. So that's a line she has to walk. And comment on this very insightful thing, too, because Ben McAdams has his Pelosi, Mia Love has her Trump.
Well, and that's the thing, is that everybody tries to separate themselves. I think if you look at any president, usually their first midterm, they're not horribly popular because sometimes it's hard to get stuff done. And so I think Mia has to try to separate herself a bit from that. Ben absolutely has to separate himself from, I think, national Democrats, especially East and West Coast Democrats who may be more liberal than Utahns are used to. But what I think is interesting about this is even as much as they may try to stay away and keep themselves out of the national or get away from their national parties, those parties are still going to come knocking with national ads and ad buys here in the district. So it's going to come to them eventually. How they handle it is going to be interesting, but I don't think they're not going to show their hand, I think, for another couple of months until they really get into the race.
Well, but that's what's so interesting about the possibility of Ben McAdams being in a primary. I don't think anyone expects him to get knocked out in convention. But there are candidates who have been very active on social media, active in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who are competing hard for that nomination. So if Ben ends up in a primary, Mayor McAdams ends up in a primary, we're going to see him being pushed toward the more progressive side to get Democratic votes. And Mia Love, meanwhile, has a free ride until November and can position herself as she wants.
Yeah, and if he goes on that progressive line, it just gives me more attack lines.
Exactly.
It does
sitting
indeed.
there for.
So while she's taking the attacks, why is he thinking about maybe I don't use the signatures? Isn't this kind of a dangerous
Well, it is something that makes you wonder, but his campaign tells me the bottom line is money. It's expensive to gather signatures. You need 7,000 within the district, and they've decided that they have better priorities for their money. They may well end up gathering signatures. They've got a little bit of time. The deadline is 2 weeks before the state convention on April 28th, but it's.
Do you see the Democrats and those delegates all kind of coming to his side right now? Is this a safe thing for him? But
well, that's what his campaign says they see. But we'll,
Okay. So we'll see how well these parties support their candidates, because we do need to talk about how the Republicans are supporting their candidates. Some interesting things this week about the Count My Vote initiative, and just when you think maybe the Republican Party is letting it go, they're not. All right. And so, Rod, let's talk for a second about Dave Bateman and what has happened this week on the agreement that he had to pay for the legal costs of the party.
There are so many strings attached to this. You're going, what is he doing here, and what is he trying to achieve? Does he want to control the State Central Committee, or are they controlling him? I mean, that's what we're all trying to figure out and see where this all goes. They are not going to give up on this issue. It's just it is part of this group. They feel that they're in the right, and they're going to fight this as long as they possibly can, even with the 10th Circuit Court ruling. I think they want to continue the fight because they think they have a constitutional issue here that they want someone to challenge. It's been challenged, and the courts have said, nope, they're fine here.
But it is a small segment of the State Central Committee.
Yeah, it's probably about 30%, maybe 40%, well, maybe 30%, maybe even less than that. But they're pushing.
And the way I read that agreement is it gives that smaller percentage of the State Central Committee the real power in this, because there's no way to break this agreement without having to lose the money that Bateman has agreed to pay.
And it shows how this group is so set apart from Rob Anderson, the party chairman.
Let me give you a graphic right now that shows exactly your point. Let me read this because it's so interesting from David Bateman. So I put in there that if you guys decide not to go through with the lawsuit, then you have to pay me back. It's paid off as long as Rob Anderson doesn't do something sneaky in the middle of the night to try to drop the lawsuit.
Well, and that kind of brings up the question, do you want one person running your party like that who isn't elected? Obviously, donors and big party players are a big part of a party. But should a party, any party, Democrat or Republican, want someone having that much control over their party? And with this issue, I think that a lot of Republicans agreed with it, especially at first. But then once it started to lose, they kind of had to question, is this worth the fight? And in an election year, when you should be focusing on your candidates, on getting out the vote, on all these other things, if you're still distracted by this lawsuit and the whole Count My Vote thing, are you taking away from maybe some of the smaller candidates, not in the big races, but some of the smaller candidates who really need the party's help?
Yeah, I went to a caucus meeting just to see what was going on with the caucus meeting, and the general feeling was we fought a good fight, the decision has been made, it's time now to move on. I think that's what a lot of Republicans around the state are feeling. We fought it, didn't win. Now it's time to move on and get past this.
How do they move on when, if they decide not to follow through with this lawsuit, they are back in debt?
Well, that's the whole crux of this agreement, right? And again, let's go back to who really benefits from that. Obviously, Bateman is suggesting that he now somehow controls the party, in essence, right? But really, what the people controlling the party are the same small group of State Central Committees. What did you say, 30, 40% max? That may be generous.
May be high.
Who have said all along, we need to keep fighting this. I mean, Rob Anderson was elected chairman at a state convention on a platform of ending the lawsuit and moving on. There are still a lot of issues with SB 54 that need to be addressed. That's why Count My Vote is trying to get on the ballot again. Things like the threshold for signature gatherings, some of the problems that have surfaced. None of that's being talked about. Things that could actually benefit Republican candidates. Instead, we're talking about continuing this lawsuit, getting another hearing at the 10th Circuit from the full panel of judges, and whatever happens there. If they don't succeed in getting the hearing or don't succeed in getting the opinion they want, trying to get before the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, this millions of dollars and months and maybe years of legal fights ahead.
And my question on this, you made a good point. Where's the rest of the Republican Party and leaders in the rest of the Republican Party standing up and saying, what Lisa just said, we elected Rob Anderson to be party chairman on the thing that we would get this lawsuit done and move on. Well, where are other Republican leaders in the state saying something about that and showing him support? Are they so afraid of this group on the State Central Committee that they don't want to get involved in this? I mean, where are these other Republicans?
It's like, now
they're
is the time to speak. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you kind of mentioned it, there is that worry, well, if we don't go along, then we're back in debt. But the problem is that even before this deal, you were still in debt from the rest of the lawsuit. Yeah. So you really aren't in a different position. If you end up dropping the lawsuit and he doesn't end up paying for it, you're still in the same position, and you have to work on that anyways.
Mm-hmm. And it may be worse because one of the big issues with this legal debt wasn't just the fact that they owed the lawyers money, it's that they weren't raising money.
Yeah.
The donor base dried up.
Yeah.
The mainstream Republicans who are looking at this chaos and saying, no.
Yeah, we don't want any part of it.
And years of legal battles are going to attract those donors? Sure. It won't.
I want to talk about one more component of this Count My Vote initiative and the compromise that was reached with the SB 54. And that's how the candidates are wooing delegates when they've already got the signatures and how they're kind of playing the caucus convention system. Glenn, give us the strategy on that, right? I've got my signatures. I'm on the primary. Now what do I do?
Because I think you still want, because there are, there's this base that still loves it. So I think that you don't want to alienate that base by just saying, well, no, thank you. I'm not going to do that. And it's always a chance to put yourself in front of voters. So even if you get the signatures and you go door knocking yourself and you get to meet people, that's great. But you also want to go to the other path and still meet voters and still get your message out. And I think no candidate really wants to turn down that opportunity to get face to face and have people ask them questions, because in the end, I think that's more important than any signature gathering can get you.
I think it is going to be so fascinating at the state Republican convention to see the support or lack of support that Mitt Romney gets in the U.S. Senate race. Now, he's going both paths. He'll be at the convention. He's on the signature route as well. But how much popularity does he have among those strong, rock-ribbed conservatives in the Utah GOP?
Well, he certainly tried to appeal to those very conservatives, right? Especially on immigration, saying he's even more firm on that than President Trump. I mean, whoever thought we'd see Mitt Romney campaigning to the right of President Trump? But yet we are.
So is this part of the strategy which you just all kind of laid out the case for? So maybe I'm on the primary no matter what, but maybe I can just say a couple things. I can knock everyone else out also. Is that kind of the strategy for some of these folks, even the local races?
Maybe that's the hope, but there are a lot of candidates. I talked to a House candidate in Utah County who gathered signatures, and I asked, how do you think this is going to go over with delegates? And he said that he is working very hard with the delegates as well, and to explain that he really, in part because of the chaos in the Republican Party, which is trickling down to the county level in some cases over this SB 54 fight, and Utah County is no exception. He really felt like he had no choice but to gather signatures to guarantee a spot on the ballot. Because remember, it was only a few weeks ago there was a question about whether the Republican Party would even be able to field candidates. And so he said that once he sits down and explains this, there's some level of understanding. And he's also used the signature gathering as an opportunity, as Glenn was saying, to get out and have that one-on-one time with voters.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are just worried. I mean, we saw what happened to Bennett back in 2010. I mean, they want their guaranteed path. They want to make sure if you're going to put in that much hard work, you do want to get on the ballot. And, sometimes things can happen at convention where you get surprised. And I think this is people's way to make sure that there are no surprises.
Right. All of these things we just talked about are impacting who the candidates are, but there's one more looming issue that will also have an impact, and that is the upcoming census. And there is an initiative out there this year, the kind of creating an independent redistricting commission, which is intending to create the lines for these candidates. Rod, take a second and help us understand the significance of this census and the impact on the Utah political process.
Well, the census will set up an independent panel, and I think there are 7 members on the panel as I get. And from what I have read, someone has told me, I haven't read this as of yet, but what someone indicated, once you're on this panel, you could end up being on this panel for life, and you will decide how these districts are broken up. Now, the concern among conservatives and Republicans is this is a democratically driven initiative. It comes from the Democrats, and that's what concerns them the most about it is, an independent commission. My concern, are voters going to educate themselves enough about what this actually does? The idea, independent commission, yeah, it's great. But go into the details. And I wonder as to how much the backers of this are hoping that voters don't dig too deeply into this and find out how it really works, because they may or may not like it.
Well,
and it's on any of these initiatives as well, I think.
One point, though, this is only a panel that can recommend
That's true.
the boundaries, right? Because constitutionally, it's the legislature,
Still the legislature
that ultimately
that has to do it.
decides. The idea is this independent commission will put political pressure to draw them in a different way.
Utah is one of 37 states that have that same process. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and that's going to, is the legislature going to go against what this panel recommends? That that's going to create a real interesting scenario.
Well, and I think it's one of those things where, we've talked about this in the past, where I think Rod's right. Are voters going to look at the details? Because on the outside, when you say, should politicians be able to select their voters, everybody hates that idea. But that's how it's done in America for the most part. And so when you talk about an independent commission, that sounds appealing to people. But I think that the kind of the backstop on that is that the legislature will still have the final say. But I think it's kind of interesting because redistricting, especially today, I mean, it's happened, gerrymandering and all that stuff has happened, since our founding. But today it's so precise with all the information we can get. It's amazing how you can cut and splice districts at a legislative level, at a congressional level. And so I think that by doing this, I think what some people are wanting is more competitive districts in general. So,
Well, and I've covered this process twice, and I've just explained to everyone how old I am, right? Because it's every 10 years.
Yeah.
Lawmakers sit down after the census and divvy up the districts. And I know last time there was a lot of frustration among Democrats and people who live in Salt Lake, in the Salt Lake area, in how Salt Lake was divided among 3 of the 4 congressional districts, as opposed to having an urban district which would encompass Salt Lake and surrounding communities. They wanted to make sure that every district had both rural and urban representatives, and conveniently limited number of Democrats, because Salt Lake is the center for Democrats. To Rod's point about the partisanship on this, how it's seen as liberal, it's interesting talking to the Better Boundaries people this week. They told me that they are selling theirs as the least partisan initiative on the ballot, right? I mean, you do have the Count My Vote and the anti-Count My Vote initiatives, but everything else is seen very much as a liberal initiative. Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, for example. They are trying to sell this as, let's take the partisanship out of, as much as we can, out of redistricting, redrawing these boundary lines.
Well, let's address the partisanship in the census itself for a minute, because a very controversial piece was put into the census proposal for this coming year, which is that people will now identify their citizenship. How, Rod, is that going to impact turnout for the people submitting their responses and the corresponding impact on the population, the districts, and the states?
That is the biggest concern of a lot of people who are opposed to this, that people who are here illegally, are not citizens of the United States, will not fill this out. The states' numbers will go down. States won't get as much congressional representation or as much in federal money. And that's their biggest concern about it, to be real honest. That's the way they're concerned about it. This has been part of the census up until, I think it was 1950, 1960. Then they went to this survey this American survey that they take, I believe, every other year. But that survey is a very small percentage of Americans. And I think that's why people are saying, wait a minute here, if we want a really true count of who the citizens of this country are, that's why we need to put this question back on the ballot.
Well, and it brings up...
I think the question, from what I understand, it asks for your legal status, I believe, is how the question is phrased. So I don't even know if the word citizenship comes up in the question. It asks the legal status.
Yeah, and obviously it's a worry, because I think when a lot of people fill that out, they're worried that someone's going to come knocking on their door next. And I think when you look at, ICE raids that have happened at courthouses and other places, that is a big worry for people who are undocumented. And so this is obviously a controversial thing, but I think most people agree that you want to know who's here regardless, and it would be interesting to get a accurate count of how many are undocumented or what their status is. But the thing is that those people, whether they're here legally or not, if they live there, they're using the services, they're using, police, fire, or hospitals. And that's part of why we do the census, is to get a better sense of who's living where and where the resources should go. So, I mean, it's important that people fill it out regardless of their status. And so I think that how they phrase the question, or what happens, or making sure that the information won't be shared with certain agencies, I think is maybe a compromise there.
But to the partisan nature of this, the states that will be most affected by this, oddly, are Democratic states, right? California,
New York,
largest, New York,
Illinois.
Yeah. And this idea of going back to something we haven't done since 1950 is coming from a Republican presidential administration. So clearly there's concern that this is being done to make it so Democratic states don't have the same level of representation, don't have the same access to federal resources, at least in the minds of a lot of people looking at this.
So, Rod, is this a political tool right here? Is that all this is? Because Glenn said it's about the administration.
Like Lisa said, I mean, everything that Donald Trump does, or his administration does now, is going to be political. I mean, it could be the deodorant that he wears could be political in this age in which we live. So I think what he's listening to Donald Trump, stands firm on whatever issue he takes, whether you like it or not.
At least for a while.
Yeah, well, but he has taken a firm stand on immigration. We're going to do something about illegal immigration in this country, and this is just part of the process. You tie in the wall and everything else.
So what do you think? Does this play to the base then? If this was what he said we'd work on, it's here, it influences these other states?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think Rod's right. Anything in this day and age is seen as political. Anything the Democrats do is political, especially anything Trump does is absolutely seen as political and partisan. I think, the troops on the border is a great example of that.
We'll talk about that, right? President Trump says 2,000 to 4,000 members of the National Guard heading to the border.
Well, and that's the thing. I covered this story this week, and President Obama and President George W. Bush also sent troops, and I think it happened without a lot of fanfare. And there's questions or whether or not it's effective and whether or not it costs too much. But when you see Donald Trump doing it, I think it happens to be a hyper-partisan issue. I know that in some of the people I talked with, they see it kind of as a political move, as playing to the base, as you said. Because the wall isn't going through so much, they worry that this is just a move to please the base in an election year where he said he would get stuff done, but things haven't really moved.
Well, and the thing on that issue is the number of illegals coming into the country illegally. Last March of 2017, was down significantly. It's way back up this March. So the question is, what's going on? Now, some will argue it's because the word is out through Mexico and Central America of the sanctuary cities idea. And everybody's come to a sanctuary city because we'll protect you. The numbers have shot up. I think the president has looked at that, looked at drugs, and said, okay, I'm acting now. My sense is he's a very impatient man. And if things don't get done, come hell or high water, he's going to get them done. And that's the reason to call up the troops. He needs to respond to his base and says, I am doing something about the one issue that I base so much of my campaign on.
But the question is why now? It was suggested as part of basically a series of tweet storms, right? That on any number of things, DACA, Chinese tariffs. There's just this huge rack of issues that suddenly we're getting these directives on, mostly in all caps via 140 characters on Twitter, right?
Well,
what is it may please the base, but going back to what we were saying about the Utah GOP and their efforts on SB 54, we're talking about a small percentage of the base, not the majority of the GOP nationally, right? The Donald Trump's base at this point. I mean, he's barely hit 50%, and that was a big move for him, right? So why now? I don't think he's answered that sufficiently for a lot of people.
I would answer, and I don't speak for him certainly, but I would answer it from a point of view that I think people elected Donald Trump to the White House to be president of the United States because they viewed him as an outsider who would get things done. And I think he gets frustrated. He is trying to get things done on DACA. He offered a deal on DACA. The Democrats said, no, we don't like this deal. He's trying to get things done, and I think his base expects him to move and to keep getting things done as much as he can. And I think he gets very frustrated with Washington. He's an outsider, doesn't understand how it works, and he's saying, I'm going to get things done. And that's the same thing can be done with tariffs and all of that. I mean, he's getting things. He wants to get things done.
Glenn, pull these two things together, and I think this idea on DACA is very, very interesting also, right? Because in this Twitter storm that Lisa was talking about, he started blaming the Democrats for not taking care of the Dreamers.
And I find that interesting because he's the one who rescinded DACA in the first place back in August or September that kind of put us in this position. And it's interesting because I talked with some Dreamers, and they're a little bit upset at the process in general. They're a little bit upset with Democrats because they feel like that they're not trying to get a deal done, so they may be able to keep this as a campaign issue. But they're also, of course, upset with Donald Trump, is what they told me, because he repealed it in the first place. They feel that they're being used as pawns somewhat to basically get the wall, and they don't feel that they should be, considering that it's so popular with so many people. I mean, it gets in the high 60s or 70% of people who think Dreamers should have a chance to at least get status, maybe not become citizens. But and so they ask the question, if this is so popular, why can't it be done as one issue? And I think what we end up seeing is that people need this, I think, to get reform done. But while they're trying to get reform done that probably isn't going to get done in an election year, they feel like they're being left behind.
Well, and the whole issue on rescinding DACA, Donald Trump and most Republicans felt that, Obama did this illegally. He shouldn't have done it. It should be congressionally done. And that's why Trump kicked it back to Congress, said, you deal with this, and they haven't.
Okay. Thank you for your insights today. Very helpful. That's it for tonight's show. For more discussion and past episodes, please join us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.